Continuing on with our reading of Mark's Gospel. Today's reading from Mark chapter 6. The apostles gathered around Jesus. They told him all that they had done and taught. But many people were coming and going, so they did not even have a chance to eat. Then Jesus said to his apostles, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place. You need to get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a quiet place. But many people who saw them leaving recognized them. They ran from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus came ashore, he saw a large crowd. He felt deep concern for them. They were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. They went across the lake and landed at Gennesaret. There they tied up the boat. As soon as Jesus and his disciples got out, the people recognized him. They ran through that whole area to bring to him those who were sick. They carried them on mats to where they heard he was. He went into the villages, the towns, and the countryside. Everywhere he went, the people brought the sick to the market areas. Those who were sick begged him to let them just touch the edge of his clothes, and all who touched his clothes were healed.
The perfect wisdom of our God, revealed in all the universe. All things created by his hand and held together at his command. He knows the mysteries of the seas, the secrets of the stars are his. He guides the planets on their way and turns the earth through another day. The matchless wisdom of his ways that mark the path of righteousness. His word a lamp unto my feet, his spirit teaching and guiding me. And all the mystery of the cross, that God should suffer for the lost, so that the fool might shame the wise, and all the glory might go to Christ. Oh, grant me wisdom from above to pray for peace and cling to love, and teach me humbly to receive the sun and rain of your sovereignty. Each strand of sorrow has a place within this tapestry of grace. So through the trials I choose to say your perfect will in your perfect way. Each strand of sorrow has a place within this tapestry of grace. So through the trials I choose to say your perfect will in your perfect way.
Our Bible focus for today is the story of David and Bathsheba in 2 Samuel in chapter 11, the first 15 verses. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Elam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness. Then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David saying, "I'm pregnant." So David sent this word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent him to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked him how Joab was, how the soldiers were, and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." So Uriah left the palace, and a gift from the king was sent after him. But Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with all his master's servants and did not go down to his house. David was told, Uriah did not go home. So he asked Uriah, "Haven't you just come from a military campaign? Why didn't you go home?" Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." Then David said to him, "Stay here one more day, and tomorrow I will send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. At David's invitation, he ate and drank with him, and David made him drunk. But in the evening Uriah went out to sleep on the mat among his master's servants. He did not go home. In the morning David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it he wrote, "Put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest. Then withdraw from him so that he will be struck down and die."
I've heard it said that a man would climb a mountain just to be with the one he loves. How many times has he broken that promise? It has never been done. Well, I never climbed the highest mountain, but I walked the hill of Calvary, and just to be with you, I would do anything. There's no price I would not pay, no. And just to be with you, I would give everything, and I would give my life away. Yeah. And I've heard it said that a man would swim the ocean just to be with the just to be with you, I would do anything. There's no price I would not pay. No, and just to be with you, I will give everything, and I would give my life away. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I know that you don't understand the fullness of my love, how I died upon the cross for your sin. And I know that you don't realize how much that I give you, and I promise I will do it all again. And just to be with you, I've done everything. There's no price I did not pay. No, and just to be with you, I gave everything. Yes, I gave my life away. Yeah, 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 I gave my life away. Yeah, 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 and just to be with you, oh, just to be with you, oh, just to be with you, oh, just to be with you.
Welcome to part 2 in this series, Giant Falls to Grace, on the stories of David from 2nd Samuel and chapter 11. Today's story, the story of David and Bathsheba. You will often hear me whinge about the way the media handles the bad news stories, often neglecting to report the good news stories. The worst stories are given such coverage that it actually encourages people to consider further the horrible behaviours that disturb us the most. Our media seems to love nothing more than to the opportunity to shine the spotlight on celebrities, celebrities who fall from grace. While our journalists do need to take responsibility for the malicious way they often present the news, they are only pandering to our expectations. The media are only a barometer by which we can gauge our own values and society's values. Well, I can imagine the headline in the Jerusalem Daily News about this scandal in David's life. A giant falls from grace, or something like that. Today, our headline, though, is Giant Falls to Grace. We'll play around with those words a little later on. David had become instantly famous when he killed the giant. That was Goliath. David is the golden boy. No king was more successful, more powerful. Israel has become the powerhouse politically in this region, largely due to David's charisma. And as the Bible paints the portrait of David, we know that David's life is built on God's grace. God blesses him, provides for him, puts him in the right place at the right time. God sets things up so that it all just falls into place. God's hand is guiding it all, making it happen. He's looking after David, and David knows it. And we know that David is just one chapter of God's story of guiding these people in their key role in God's great big salvation plan for all humanity. But today's episode is the moment that David falls. Falls from, well, we could say falls from grace. David has become a predator. In the animal world, a predator is simply a creature who is further up the food chain, entitled to, made to feed on weaker species. That's how God made nature, but it isn't how he made humanity. And it's not how we are meant to live. As a giant among kings and on the world stage, David is now a very powerful figure. There is nothing he cannot have. Power gives him and gives us privileges and responsibility. And it's so easy to abuse power. As we think about the way we usually exercise power over each other, it's force and brute strength that comes to mind. Jesus was talking about the way people tend to, and I quote Matthew 20 verse 25, lord it over each other. That is, exercise power over another person. He then points out that he has come to be powerful in a completely different way. He will show power in a way where the first will be last and the last will be first. He teaches about the power of service. He begins to let us in on God's greatest expression of power, and that's not about his power to create a universe, impressive though that is, or to instantly have more power than 1,000 armies. His greatest power is seen in his self-sacrificing love. So I'm going to link God's grace to God's power. God gives his grace to us all, and his grace is his unique expression of power. Let's stay with this for a moment. When in your life have you been given such power and privilege? Who is it that you have power over? Where do you have the power to influence others and to change things? God places all of us in positions of responsibility and privilege, and therefore power. No one misses out. We're all given an opportunity somewhere in our life. We are all powerful people, whether we like it or not. And when that power and responsibility and privilege comes our way, God, of course, asks us to take care, to make decisions, to use this power and privilege for good and not to abuse it. I wish you well with the power and privilege that God graces your life with. It is so important that you receive encouragement and support to use your grace power, God's greatest strength in your life. Powerful man that David becomes, his is a giant fall. And like David, we fall. We fall in our lives, we fail, we abuse the power and the opportunity he gives us. And when we fall, we are then to discover that God's grace isn't finished with us. And that's why our theme here is giant falls to grace. This sex scandal in David's life is the pivot in this epic story. And even if you don't know much about all the story, the detail so far, and even if you don't know much about the dynasty of David's family and the sons and generations of David's family that inherit the throne, right here is where the epic story takes a whole new direction. As David becomes king, he killed a giant. He becomes the giant of Israel's kings. But because of this sex scandal, David the giant falls. This giant falls from his place of privilege to a place where he will discover God's grace. Now, we Aussies are rather famous for the tall poppy syndrome. Somehow we are fascinated when a celebrity falls from grace and is no longer quite so tall. In fact, we find it important that everyone is the same height. Sometimes we feel we need to bring another person down to the ground level that all of us need to travel on. Somehow a feature of Australian society is that a lot of people take delight when a sky-high celebrity is brought back to earth. As we observe David's fall from grace, the star that is brought by scandal back to earth, please recognise that David is brought down to the level we all live on. All of us are in this space. All of us in the falls of our life, we need grace after the fall. We need the grace that God only can give us, that is still there for us after any fall. And when we fall, what does God think? How does he feel when a celebrity like David, a giant identity, falls from the privilege and responsibility given to him, a place where God has placed him? Next week we'll go to part 3 of this series, to the next phase of the story where God sends Nathan to David to confront him with God's point of view, the abuse of power that he is guilty of, and his need to be forgiven. The biggest news is not the fall from grace, a position of grace. The biggest news is not this scandal. Far more significant is the what next, the recovery, the way David is helped up from the fall. David will need help from this fall. He won't be able to get up by himself. And as we follow through with this episode, we'll see how God's grace and favour doesn't leave him. It isn't taken away from David. God continues to help him. And the first part of God's help is to help David learn how forgiveness works. That's how God's grace works. By himself, David's first response is to run and hide. He has to hide what he has done. There are a few subtleties in this story that you might have missed. The moment after David has stolen another man's wife, he applies his brilliance to the task of covering up the scandal. Now you might think Uriah, husband of Bathsheba, is a bit thick, because when David invites him home from battle, and by the way, any king worth his salt will be out on the battlefield with his army, but David, for some reason, is just lazing about back in his royal palace. David wants Uriah to sleep with his wife, so that when a baby arrives in 9 months' time, everyone can check the diary and notice that 9 months earlier, Uriah had in fact checked in for a sickie and spent the night at home. Uriah, however, is faithful to his king, loyal to the country and God, and when he refuses to go home to his wife, he's just following the honour, his code of honour. In the business of war, soldiers must remain focused and clean. And so a soldier by law facing battle is forbidden in Torah to sleep with his menstruating wife. So Uriah the Hittite is doing the honourable, the right thing by turning down the king's offer to spend a night at home. This only leads David to a further abuse of his power, rigging it so that Uriah will be placed in the army in a place where he will most certainly lose his life. And so David is now also guilty of murder. The help that David needs to get up from in his fall from grace will be from the person God sends to speak God's word. Finally, a word of love, a word spoken in love, but a word that will confront and accuse and recognise the crime, but also a word from God that points David toward a path of recovery and then toward his continued responsibility. There will be consequences. From this moment, David's family will be plagued by division and corruption and hatred and violence. David will have to take responsibility for these. Perhaps you've been playing around, or the words have been playing around in your mind, the words of this headline. Before we leave it for another headline that includes grace. What happens when the noun giant becomes an adjective? Falls becomes a noun. Now let the adjective giant shift so that it becomes an adjective for grace. Now, just in case you didn't know it, each one of you is a giant example of God's grace. He has given each of us so much. Each of us has lived through a giant fall from God's grace, we might say. It's the fall which helps us appreciate the gigantic size of God's love and grace. Each of us has stories to tell of suffering and hurt and mistakes, goodness knows. Each of us knows of God's giant-sized patience, persistence, power to get us back on track, back to where he made us, back to where he wants us to be, back up to where he is. But only to find that he actually comes down to where we are at ground level. The only giant we've considered today is the gigantic grace of God. His grace enables us to, and here you might finish the sentence, his grace enables us to, and if it were possible for you to have a conversation with someone next to you, just finish that sentence off. His grace enables us to, and I challenge you to find 3 or 4 different endings to that statement. God bless your digging deep in this word, and may it grow in you.
How deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure, that he should give his only Son to make a wretch his treasure. How great the pain of searing loss, the Father turns his face away, as wounds which mar the chosen one bring many sons to glory.
Behold the man upon a cross, my sin upon his shoulders. Ashamed, I hear my mocking voice call out among the scoffers.
It was my sin that held him there until it was accomplished. His dying breath has brought me life. I know that it is finished. I will not boast in anything, no gifts, no power, no wisdom, but I will boast in Jesus Christ, his death and resurrection. Why should I gain from his reward? I cannot give an answer, but this I know with all my heart, his wounds have paid my ransom. Why should I gain from his reward? I cannot give an answer.
But this I know with all my heart, his wounds have paid my ransom.
A prayer for our earth. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace.